The mop moved in slow, deliberate arcs. Left, right, left. Sarah Chun had been perfecting this motion for 14 months, and she decided somewhere around month 3 that mopping a floor correctly was not unlike clearing a room. You had to be methodical, you had to account for every corner, and you had to trust the process even when it felt tedious. The difference, of course, was that a poorly mopped floor left a streak. A poorly cleared room left a body count. She preferred the streak. It was 0612 hours at Fort Bravo Military Base, Mojave Desert, California, and the main corridor of Building 7. The administrative hub smelled like industrial cleaner and bad coffee from the mess hall 2 doors down. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Sarah liked this hour. The base was waking up but hadn't yet remembered it was alive, and in that liminal quiet she could work without being noticed. Which was, in the end, the whole point. She was wearing the standard-issue gray uniform of Bravo Cleaning Services, the civilian contract company that handled base sanitation. The uniform was 3 sizes too large, deliberately chosen. Her dark hair was tucked beneath a faded Fort Bravo baseball cap, a promotional item from a base fund run she'd never attended. She wore no makeup. Her eyes, the color of deep water at dusk, a shade between black and navy that several people across several continents had found to be the last thing they ever clearly saw, were aimed at the floor. On the left sleeve of her uniform, just above the cuff, there was a small patch. Most people never noticed it. Sarah had considered removing it a dozen times. She kept it there the way some people keep an old scar, not because they're proud of it, but because they haven't yet decided what it means to be the kind of person who removes it. The patch was circular, roughly the diameter of a quarter, dark gray on charcoal black. It depicted a stylized silhouette of a figure, gender-neutral, impossible to date, mid-stride, half dissolved into shadow, as though the person in the image was in the act of ceasing to exist. Beneath the figure, in lettering so small it required proximity to read, were 4 words. Ghost Unit, Shadow Protocol. 23 people in the world had ever worn that patch. 12 of them were still alive. Sarah Chun was one of them. She moved the mop left, right, left. Down the corridor, a door banged open, and the sound of heavy boots on linoleum announced the arrival of Fort Bravo's newest intake of infantry recruits, 36 men and women who had completed basic training 8 weeks ago, and were now stationed here for advanced tactical instruction. They were loud. They were confident in the way that people are confident before reality has had a chance to introduce itself. Sarah didn't look up. She had learned, very early in her adult life, that not looking up was a survival skill as much as a social one. The boots grew louder. She moved the mop to the far wall, working along the baseboard with the efficiency of someone who has made peace with unglamorous work. She did not hear the universe preparing to end Tyler Brooks' career. But it was, even then, quietly beginning. Fort Bravo had a reputation. Not the good kind. Not the kind that drew ambitious officers angling for promotions or decorated veterans seeking a last meaningful posting. Fort Bravo was the kind of base that existed because the military needed a place to put people who were still being decided upon, recruits whose potential hadn't yet crystallized, units awaiting deployment orders, equipment awaiting assessment. It was a base in a state of permanent holding pattern, commanded with tired competence by Colonel Marcus Webb, a man who had once been young and furious and is now just very, very good at his job. Webb was 52 but looked 45 on good days and 60 on bad ones. He had sandy hair going determinately gray, a jaw like a structural component, and the kind of eyes that had seen enough that they'd developed a permanent evaluative quality. He couldn't stop assessing people, situations, exits, threats. A lifetime of training had rewired his perception until there was no such thing as idle observation. Everything Webb looked at, he was also measuring. He had been at Fort Bravo for 14 months. Sarah Chun had arrived 16 months ago. He hadn't recognized her at first. Why would he? The woman he'd known, the woman he still occasionally dreamed about in the way that survivors dream about the moments that defined them, had been kitted in tactical black, face paint smeared across angular cheekbones, moving through the dark of a Tbilisi back alley with the silence of something that had evolved specifically for darkness. The woman pushing the mop through Building 7 in an oversized gray uniform was, on the surface, a different species. But Webb had always been thorough. And 3 months into her employment at Fort Bravo, he had looked up from his morning coffee and seen, just briefly, through the window of his office as she rolled her cart past, the patch on her left sleeve. He had spilled the coffee. He had then done what Colonel Marcus Webb always did when confronted with information that required careful processing. He had done nothing for 48 hours while he thought. Then he had walked to the base medical office and had a quiet conversation with Dr. Angela Torres, the base physician, who was the only other person at Fort Bravo with the relevant security clearance. She asked for a clean exit. Torres had told him simply. Her paperwork is clean. Her record is. Torres had paused, choosing the word carefully. Untranscribed. Untranscribed, Webb had repeated. That's the official term. Yes. He had understood. Untranscribed meant that Sarah Chin's service record existed, but in a form that civilian government databases could not access, and that most military databases above colonel level would return classified. Her combat history, her missions, her decorations, all of it sealed beneath 17 levels of security clearance, locked inside a file that required a 4-digit authorization code that changed weekly and the physical signature of a 3-star general or above to open. The patch on her sleeve was the only acknowledgement she allowed herself. Webb had respected her choice. He had told no one. He had continued to pass her in corridors without acknowledgement, the way you pass someone who has explicitly asked not to be greeted. He understood, or thought he did, why a person like Sarah Chun might choose this, the quiet base, the invisible work, the mop and the cart, and the gray uniform. He had known soldiers who came back from the kind of work she had done and simply needed a place to breathe, a place where no one expected anything, a place where the stakes of every day were floors and windows and the correct dilution of cleaning solution, and where nobody died. He understood all of that. What he hadn't anticipated was Tyler Brooks. Tyler Brooks had arrived at Fort Bravo 6 weeks ago as part of the new intake, and he had made an impression within his first 24 hours that was, depending on your perspective, either remarkable or exhausting. His father was Brigadier General Arthur Brooks, a man whose career had been built on aggressive ambition and a specific talent for political maneuvering within military bureaucracy. Tyler had grown up on bases, in officers' quarters, in the company of people who stood straighter when his father entered a room. He had learned early that rank was the organizing principle of human interaction, and he had further concluded, with the confident wrongness of someone who has been corrected by no one of consequence, that rank was something inherited as much as earned. He was 22. He was 6 feet 1 inch tall with the lean musculature of someone who spent a lot of time at the gym and wanted you to know it. He had a clean jaw and bright eyes and the kind of smile that looked engineered for a recruitment poster. He was, by the objective metrics of infantry training, a decent soldier, above average in physical assessment, reliable in marksmanship, quick enough in tactical exercises. The problem was that Tyler Brooks had never, in his entire young life, been made to feel small. And small people who have never been made to feel small are a specific and predictable kind of dangerous. In his 6 weeks at Fort Bravo, he had already filed one informal complaint against Sergeant Owens for inadequate respect for officer rank, dismissed, had taken a specialist's parking spot without acknowledgement, twice, and had been overheard referring to the base's female communications officer as the secretary to a group of his bunkmates. Each incident had been logged. None had been significant enough, individually, to trigger formal action. Fort Bravo was watching him the way you watch a storm on the horizon, with the knowledge that it was coming and the uncertainty of how bad it would be. The incident happened on a Tuesday, which was, in Sarah's experience, always when things happened. Not Mondays, which people were prepared for, and not Fridays, which arrived with their own emotional armor. Tuesdays were when the world caught you assuming everything was proceeding normally. It was 1,340 hours. The main recreational area of Building 4, a wide-open space with pool tables, a row of vending machines, and mismatched couches that had survived at least 3 administrations, was at moderate capacity. Approximately 30 soldiers were present, a mix of new intake and station permanent personnel. Some were playing cards. Some were watching sports highlights on the wall-mounted screen. Some were on their phones. Sarah was working in the far corner, cleaning the windows with the methodical attention she gave everything when she heard the boots. She recognized Tyler's gait before she turned. She'd spent the past 6 weeks conducting the unconscious threat assessment That was simply how her brain processed the world, and Tyler Brooks had registered early. Loud footfalls, entitled rhythm, the particular cadence of someone who walks as though the floor is doing him a favor. She didn't turn. She kept cleaning the window. Hey. The word landed like a rock in still water. Not directed at her. Not yet. She could tell from the direction of the voice and the sounds of the room shifting, attention gathering, that Tyler was talking to someone else, showing off, building an audience. She knew the structure of it without looking. She'd seen it in 16 countries. Hey, you. Now it was directed at her. She turned. Tyler Brooks stood 8 feet away with 2 of his bunkmates flanking him, both of whom had the look of people who had privately signed the contract of going along with whatever Tyler did, because the alternative was being on the receiving end of it themselves. Tyler's boots were regulation, standard-issue combat boots, and they had, at some point in the morning, apparently passed through a muddy drainage area near the motor pool. They were comprehensively caked. His expression was one Sarah had cataloged and filed under aggressive entitlement. Young male, resource-wealthy background. She had a whole taxonomy for expressions. It was a professional habit. You're cleaning, right? Tyler said. He said it the way someone says obviously. My boots need cleaning. The room had gone quiet. Not silent. The television was still going. Cards were still rustling. But the human element had stilled, that specific social suspension that happens when everyone realizes they might be about to watch something. Sarah looked at him, then at his boots, then back at him. I clean floors and surfaces, she said. Her voice was low, even, and entirely without performance. Building maintenance. You'd need the laundry and equipment facility for personal gear. I'd need. Tyler repeated it back to her, performing incredulity for his audience. A small smile. You'd need. He said it the way you say something that is inexplicably funny. She's giving me instructions. He turned to his companions, then back, the smile widening into something that didn't look like a smile at all. You know what you are? You're a janitor. You're here to clean things. I am a soldier of the United States Army, and I'm telling you to clean my boots. The equipment facility is. I heard you the first time. He cut across her, and the cut was deliberate, surgical. He took a step closer. He was a foot taller. He used the height. Do you understand who my father is? Do you know what rank I have? Sarah said nothing. You're a civilian contractor, Tyler continued. His voice had dropped into the register that people use when they want to sound cold instead of angry. You're on this base because people like me allow it. You push a mop. You clean up after us. That's your job, and I am directly telling you, right now, in front of witnesses, clean my boots. He took the final step forward and dropped one boot on the cart in front of her, deliberately toppling a bottle of surface cleaner that bounced across the floor and rolled under a table. Or I'll make sure everyone on this base knows what you are, he said. Then, to the room, with the performance expanding to fill the space. She's a trash collector, guys. She's the base trash collector, right? Am I wrong? This is the old janitor lady who cleans our toilets. He laughed. Clean my boots, trash. The room was silent. Lieutenant Jessica Holt, 26, stationed near the vending machines, felt something coil uncomfortably in her chest. She was standing up. She remembered afterward that she had stood, as if preparing to say something, but she hadn't said it. Not yet. She would spend a long time afterward examining that hesitation and not fully forgiving herself for it. Sarah Chan looked at Tyler Brooks for a long moment. Her face was entirely still. Not the stillness of suppression, not the tight-jaw controlled stillness of someone containing anger. The stillness of someone for whom this situation occupied approximately the same threat level as a minor change in weather. She picked the fallen bottle up from the floor without looking at him, set it upright on the cart, and took the handle of the mop. I'll finish the window, she said. She turned back to the window. Tyler stared at the back of her head, recalibrating, thrown off by an opponent who refused to perform the role assigned to her. His bunkmates were exchanging looks. The room's attention was flickering. The drama had been promised and then not delivered, and people weren't sure how to calibrate. I'm not done with you, Tyler said. I know, Sarah said, and kept cleaning the window. It was this, not the defiance, not the composure, but the I know, the 2 words that acknowledged him without fearing him, that pushed Tyler across the line from performance into genuine anger. He reached forward and grabbed her shoulder, pulling her around. Look at me when I'm. That's enough. The voice that cut through Building 4 at 1,341 hours on that Tuesday was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of voice that had spent 30 years not needing to raise itself, the kind of voice that understood that volume was for people who lacked authority, and that true authority didn't shout because it didn't need to. It simply arrived, and the room rearranged itself around it. Colonel Marcus Webb stood in the doorway. He was in full uniform. He had been passing from the administrative block to the motor pool and had turned into Building 4 for a reason he would later not be able to clearly articulate, except that something, some professional instinct honed over 3 decades, had pulled his eyes toward the window in the corridor as he'd walked past, and he had seen, through the glass, the tableau inside. He had seen Tyler Brooks grip the shoulder of the janitor. He had seen the janitor's profile, the cap, the gray uniform, the stillness. And he had seen, catching the late afternoon light as she turned, the patch on her left sleeve. The circular patch, gray on charcoal, the half-dissolved figure, the 4 words too small to read from here, but which Webb knew with the specificity of something burned into memory. Ghost Unit, Shadow Protocol. He stood in the doorway for 3 seconds in which 30 people watched him and no one breathed. Then he stepped into the room. At 13:45, for minutes after Colonel Webb entered Building 4, Private Danny Reyes, Tyler's bunkmate, sent a text to 6 other soldiers that read only, "Bro, you need to come to B4, something is happening." By 1400, the story was spreading through Fort Bravo's unofficial communication network, the particular rapid transmission system of military gossip that could disseminate information faster than official channels and with considerably more embellishment. The story, at this stage, was simple. Tyler Brooks had gone after the janitor and the colonel had walked in. Reactions varied. Sergeant Dale Owens, 35, who prided himself on knowing everything that happened at Fort Bravo before it happened, heard the story from a specialist at 1415 and felt the particular irritation of a man who does not like being surprised. He had, it must be noted, been aware of Tyler's behavioral pattern and had chosen, on 2 separate occasions, to categorize it as acceptable friction rather than a disciplinary issue. He would spend the next 12 hours reclassifying that decision. In the base medical office, Dr. Angela Torres set down her clipboard when Lieutenant Holt knocked on her door at 14:30. "I need to ask you something," Holt said. "About the janitor, Sarah Chun. Does she have some kind of—" She paused, visibly struggling with how to articulate what she'd seen in Colonel Webb's face when he'd looked at that patch. "Does she have a history here?" Before Fort Bravo. Torres regarded the young lieutenant for a moment with the expression of someone reviewing classified information internally. "She's a civilian contractor," Torres said carefully. "Is there something specific you needed?" He looked at her like— Holt stopped. The colonel looked at her like he knew her, like she was someone. "I'm not able to discuss any individual's personnel information," Torres said. And then, not entirely without compassion, "But Lieutenant, people are often more than they appear to be. That's rarely something they choose to display." Holt left the medical office with more questions than she'd arrived with. In the single-occupancy cleaning staff quarters that Sarah had been assigned, a small room near the base maintenance section, utilitarian and efficient, which she had made no effort to personalize except for a single shelf of books, 3 on topology, 1 on orchid cultivation, and a worn paperback translation of Marcus Aurelius. Sarah was sitting on her bed, still in her work uniform, hands folded in her lap. She was very still. This was not unusual. Sarah Chun had a capacity for stillness that most people found unnerving when they noticed it. She had developed it in stages, first as a field technique, then as a survival mechanism, and eventually as something that was simply part of how she occupied space. She could stay very still for a very long time, and during that stillness process enormous amounts of information and make very clear-eyed decisions. She was processing now. What had happened in Building 4 was not, in any objective sense, a serious incident. She had been insulted by a child. She had been grabbed, briefly, by someone who did not understand what grabbing her meant. She had not been hurt. She had not been threatened in any way that engaged her actual threat response systems. The episode had been unpleasant in the particular way that pettiness is unpleasant, not dangerous but dispiriting, the reminder that human beings, given a small measure of institutional power, will very often use it to diminish. That was not what she was processing. She was processing Colonel Webb's face. She had recognized him before he'd taken 2 steps into the room. Marcus Webb, 14 months at the same base, and she'd managed to avoid direct eye contact precisely once before, a narrow morning in the corridor where she'd been facing the wall. She'd known this was coming. She'd known, probably, since she'd chosen Fort Bravo, that this was the nature of the risk, and she'd chosen it anyway, because Fort Bravo was close enough to her sister's home in San Bernardino that she could drive there on weekends, and because it was quiet, and because she had been so very, very tired. She'd known Webb. Not closely. Their professional intersection had been narrow, a single joint operation, for years ago, in Georgia, the country, not the state. She had been the Ghost Unit operative assigned to extract an asset that Webb's team had been protecting. She had gone in after the extraction protocol had failed, alone, in the dark, and she had brought the asset out, and she had kept Webb's entire unit from being rolled up in the process. It had taken 11 hours and 2 lateral knife wounds that had required 43 stitches total. Webb had seen her face in the light of a doorway in Tbilisi at 0300 hours. He had recognized the patch. She had watched his face in Building 4 do the same recognition she'd seen in Tbilisi. The rapid calculation, the recalibration of everything. The very particular expression of a man who had just realized that what he thought was a civilian cleaning a window was something else entirely. She had, for a single second, closed her eyes. "I know," she'd said to Tyler, and she'd meant it in more dimensions than he could possibly have understood. Webb had not immediately confronted Tyler in Building 4. He had assessed the room, assessed Tyler, assessed the way Tyler's hand was still on Sarah's shoulder, and said 2 words, "Let go." That Tyler had complied with before he'd fully understood what he was doing, because the voice behind the words left no other option. Then Webb had looked at Sarah. She had turned back to the window. He had let it sit for a moment that lasted a long time for both of them, then had addressed the room in general. "Back to your stations." And then, to Tyler specifically, "Brooks. My office. 1,600 hours." And then he had left, because to stay would have been to make this more, and Webb was still deciding what this was going to be. At 15:45, Webb sat behind his desk in the Building 1 corner office and tried to organize the past 45 minutes into something manageable. The incident with Tyler Brooks was straightforward. Insubordinate conduct toward a civilian contractor, physical contact constituting assault, pattern of behavior consistent with previous logged incidents, sufficient for formal disciplinary action up to and including request for reassignment. That was simple. What was not simple was the patch. Webb pulled open his desk drawer and took out the secure notepad he kept there. Analog, no digital trace, and wrote 4 words on it. Ghost Unit, Shadow Protocol. He looked at the words. He thought about Sarah Chen's face, still, composed, entirely unfrightened, as Tyler Brooks had loomed over her and called her trash. He thought about Tbilisi, the doorway, the 43 stitches he'd been told about secondhand, the asset they'd recovered. A man who had subsequently provided intelligence that had prevented a coordinated infrastructure attack across 3 NATO nations. The number of lives that information had saved. The fact that the woman who had made that possible was currently cleaning windows in Building 4. He thought about what he knew about Ghost Unit and Shadow Protocol, which was, at kernel level, partial. He knew it existed. He knew it was special operations under a separate classified command structure. He knew its operatives operated with an unusual degree of individual discretion and that their mission records were among the most tightly secured in the entire military apparatus. He also knew, from a fragment of briefing he'd received once in passing at a command conference, that Ghost Unit had been officially decommissioned 2 years ago following a classified incident, and that the surviving operatives had been given a specific choice of exit arrangements. Sarah Chun had chosen this. He tried to fully internalize that. She had chosen this. Voluntarily. With full knowledge of the alternative. She had chosen gray uniform and mop over whatever the military would have offered. Officer's rank at the least, instructor role, consultant position. She had chosen to be invisible. He thought about what it meant that he was now the reason she might not be able to stay invisible. He also thought, because Marcus Webb was a thorough man, about Tyler Brooks' father, Brigadier General Arthur Brooks, who was stationed at the Pentagon, who had the ear of people whose ears mattered, and who had a demonstrated pattern of intervening in disciplinary matters that involved his son. If Webb wrote a formal report and Tyler's father intervened, and the investigation involved pulling background on everyone present. Standard procedure. Sarah's cover would dissolve inside 72 hours. He closed the notepad. He thought for a very long time. At 1600 exactly, there was a knock at his door. Come in. Tyler Brooks entered with the careful posture of someone who has been told to appear in a commanding officer's office and has decided that the best strategy is to front-load with confidence. He stopped, stood at attention with a crispness that was just this side of performance. Sir. Webb regarded him without expression. Sit down. Tyler sat. His eyes moved around the office with the quick assessment of someone trying to read the room. Webb looked at him for a moment. Tell me what happened in Building 4 today. Tyler's version was, predictably, a work of creative revision. There had been a misunderstanding. He'd been asking the contractor for assistance, and she'd been unresponsive. He may have used some language that was, in retrospect, inappropriate, but the situation had been frustrating. He hadn't grabbed her, exactly, it was more of a, I was in the doorway, Webb said. Tyler stopped. I was in the doorway for approximately 30 seconds before I spoke. I saw what happened. Webb kept his voice level, factual, the way you recite information that doesn't require emphasis because the facts are the emphasis. You placed an item on her cart, knocking over her equipment. You referred to her, in front of approximately 30 witnesses, as trash and the base trash collector. You placed your hand on her shoulder against her will. You used your father's rank as a form of coercion. Tyler's composure was holding, but it was working to hold. Sir, with respect, I was. This is your fourth documented behavioral incident in 6 weeks, Webb continued, as though Tyler hadn't spoken. I have the logs in front of me. The parking violations, the complaint against Sergeant Owens, the comments in the barracks. He paused. Is there anything you'd like me to add to that record regarding today? Sir, I don't think the incident today merits the level of. She's a civilian contractor under the protection of the base, Webb said. She is entitled to the same professional courtesy extended to any personnel on this installation. That is not a gray area. She's a janitor, Tyler said, and then clearly heard himself and tried to walk it back. I mean, she's a civilian contractor. Yes, and I understand that, but, do you? Something in the delivery of those 2 words made Tyler stop. There was a quality in Webb's voice that Tyler, who had grown up around military authority, recognized as unusual. Not anger, not the disciplinary register, but something stranger. Something that might have been, if Tyler had been more perceptive, recognition. The way people sound when they're talking about something that has actual weight. Do you understand what that means? Webb continued. A civilian contractor on a military installation? Yes, sir. Tell me what you know about the ghost unit. The non sequitur landed like a thrown object. Tyler blinked. What? The ghost unit. Shadow protocol. You're the son of a brigadier general, you've grown up in military households. You've been in service for 2 years. What do you know about it? Tyler's expression had shifted fully now into confusion. Not much, sir. It's a classified special operations program. I know it was decommissioned. Do you know why? No, sir. Webb looked at him for another long moment. Then he opened his desk and placed a single sheet of paper on the desk between them. It was a standard incident report form, blank, with nothing filled in. What happens next, Webb said, depends significantly on decisions I'm making right now. And those decisions are being informed by information you don't have. I want you to sit with that. He pushed the incident report across the desk toward Tyler without picking up a pen. I am not, at this moment, formally documenting today's incident. I am choosing, right now, to give you the opportunity to understand something before consequences arrive. Because consequences are coming, son. Regardless of what I do. Do you understand me? Tyler was very still. No, sir. Not fully. I know, Webb said. I know you don't. That's the problem. He leaned forward slightly. There are people in this world, Brooks, who have done things that don't have paperwork. Not because they haven't earned the paperwork, but because the work they did was the kind that doesn't get written down. The kind that keeps people like you safe in your bed on the base. Do you follow? Yes, sir. Good. You're dismissed. You will report to Sergeant Owens at 0600 tomorrow and inform him that you are requesting additional duty assignments, at his discretion, for the next 30 days. You will do this as a voluntary action. Am I clear? Tyler left. Webb sat alone in his office for several minutes, then picked up the secure landline on his desk and made a call. He had been thinking, throughout the conversation with Tyler about one specific memory from Tbilisi. He'd been in the safe house with 6 of his unit and the asset, a frightened, middle-aged Georgian man named David who had been leaking structural intelligence to Western contacts for 3 years and whose cover had just been blown by a compromised handler. Outside, the extraction protocol was dead. The clean routes were burned. 3 hostile surveillance teams were working the neighborhood. They'd been waiting for a second team that wasn't coming. At 0247 hours, the basement window had opened from the outside. Sarah Chun had come in first, horizontal, flat to the floor, moving like water, and then was standing. She was 5 feet 5 inches tall. She was covered in what he'd later identified as a combination of drainage pipe grease and someone else's blood. Her face was entirely composed. She had looked at Webb, assessed his 6 people and the asset in approximately 2 seconds, and said, quietly, "East Alley is clear for 11 minutes. I'll go first, you follow with the asset, your people cover rear. Don't bunch up." She had not introduced herself. She had not asked permission. She had simply told them what was happening, because she had looked at the situation and understood it completely, and the most efficient path from that understanding was to convey it to the people who needed to know. Webb had followed her out of that basement with David between himself and a sergeant, through an alley that was, exactly as promised, clear, and into a vehicle that materialized out of darkness at a precise point, and they'd moved. He'd seen her profile in the vehicle, lit briefly by a passing streetlight. She'd had the 2 lateral cuts across her ribcage that he hadn't noticed in the basement. One through her jacket, one through the shirt beneath it. She hadn't mentioned them. She hadn't flinched. She'd watched the road with that quality of attention that he'd spent the subsequent years trying to describe and had finally settled on operational clarity. The ability to perceive, without distortion from fear or adrenaline or hope, what was actually in front of you. She'd gotten them out of Tbilisi. She hadn't told him her name. He'd gotten the name from a debrief 3 weeks later, in a classified notation so buried in footnotes that he'd nearly missed it. Extraction credited to Ghost Unit Operative, designation Sandpiper. Field ID, Sarah Chun. That was the whole entry. He'd read it and thought, someone crossed half a city in the dark with 2 knife wounds to pull us out, and she gets 4 words in a footnote. And now she was cleaning windows at Fort Bravo. And Tyler Brooks had called her trash. Sarah was still in her quarters when the knock came at 18:30. She opened the door. Webb. He was in civilian clothes, base casual, off-duty, which she understood as a deliberate signal. This was not an official visit. He had his hands loose at his sides, and his face had the quality of a man who has been rehearsing something. "I know," she said, before he could speak. He nodded. "May I come in?" She stepped aside. He looked at the room. The books, the bare surfaces, the efficiency of it. He sat in the single chair. She sat on the bed. For a moment neither of them spoke. "You've been here 16 months, he said finally. "Yes. I've been here 14. "I know. I recognized you inside the first week." She said it without apology or accusation. "I assessed the risk and concluded it was manageable." "The patch." "I know." She looked at her sleeve. "I should take it off. I keep not taking it off." She said it simply, the way you admit a small irrationality, and the simplicity of it tightened something in Webb's chest. "What happened today?" he started. "Was a kid with a power problem and no understanding of consequence," she said. "It wasn't anything. He put his hands on you." "Colonel Webb." Her voice was gentle, which he hadn't expected. "I have been in positions that make today look like a traffic infraction. I'm not asking for intervention. I'm not offering intervention," he said. "Or not only that." He paused. "I'm offering. The situation is going to become complicated regardless of what you or I prefer. Tyler Brooks' father is Arthur Brooks. I know. If this escalates, then it escalates." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't leave the unit to hide forever. I left to stop for a while. There's a difference." Webb looked at her. Are you ready to unstop? If it comes to that." She considered the question as though it deserved consideration. "I'm never going to be what I was," she said. "I made peace with that. But I didn't cease to be who I am just because I changed what I do." She looked at the patch. "What I was and what I am aren't different things. I just got tired of the verb form." He didn't fully understand that, but he didn't need to. He nodded. "I made a call this afternoon," he said. "I want to be transparent with you." She looked at him. "I contacted General Morrison's office." The room was very still for a moment. You had authorization to do that, Sarah said. Not a question. A confirmation. I have kernel-level access to Ghost Unit contact protocols. I didn't activate anything. I left a message. She'll come. Probably. You know she'll come in person. I know. Sarah Chen looked at the far wall for a moment. Then she said, Okay. 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 If this is the moment it becomes something, then it becomes something. She stood. Was there anything else, Colonel? He stood as well. For what it's worth, he started. You don't have to, she said. She meant it kindly. Tbilisi was 4 years ago. You were doing your job, and I was doing mine. He looked at the patch again. I should have. You held the line on Tyler Brooks today, she said. That was enough. That was exactly enough. She said it with the precision of someone who measured things accurately. Good night, Colonel. General Patricia Morrison arrived at Fort Bravo at 0800 on Thursday. She did not arrive with announcement, because announcement was not how Patricia Morrison moved through the world. She arrived in a standard government sedan with 2 aides, both of whom had the contained energy of people who had learned to be ready for anything, because their boss was always ready for everything. She was 55 years old with gray-white hair cut to 1.5 inches, a face that had been described variously as handsome, formidable, and, by the enemies of the United States of America, as the last thing they wanted to see. She wore 5 stars. She wore, on her left sleeve, the same patch Sarah Chun wore, except hers was gold-stitched on black, which denoted founding member. She walked into Fort Bravo's main administrative building at 0810, and the reception desk specialist stood up so fast her chair rolled back 3 feet. Ma'am. Colonel Webb. Where is he? Building 1, ma'am, he's. She was already moving. Webb had been informed of her arrival approximately 4 minutes before she walked into his office. He stood. She looked at him with the evaluative clarity of someone who has no time for social scaffolding. Tell me everything. He told her everything. She listened without expression, without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for exactly 8 seconds. He counted, because he knew Morrison and knew her silences were metered. Brooks, she said. Arthur Brooks' boy. Yes, ma'am. Arthur Brooks is being considered for a 3rd star, she said. He will not get it. That's a separate matter, and it was already in motion before this. You don't need to know the details. She paused. Where is Chin now? Working. Building 7. She requested no interruption to her schedule. Morrison's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but Webb caught it. Something that might have been, on a less armored face, called respect. Or recognition. Of course she did, Morrison said. At 1,100 hours, Fort Bravo's main training ground was in use for a standard PT assessment for the new intake. All 36 recruits were present, along with Sergeant Owens and 3 supervisory officers, including Lieutenant Holt. Tyler Brooks had reported to Owens at 0600 as instructed and had been assigned 3 weeks of additional base maintenance duties, an assignment that, in military culture, carried the specific weight of being assigned a task that required no skill to reinforce where you stood. He was enduring this with imperfect grace, which was better than it could have been. At 11:15, a woman walked onto the training ground. She was in uniform. She wore 5 stars. Every soldier on the training ground, all 36 recruits, Owens, all 3 officers, performed the same instinctive movement within approximately 2 seconds of seeing the stars. They came to attention the way tall grass goes vertical in a strong wind, immediately, completely, without deciding to. Tyler Brooks came to attention. Sarah Chun, who had been walking across the far edge of the training ground with her cart, stopped. Morrison had not looked at her yet. She was looking at Owens, who had stepped forward with the coordination of a man whose entire muscular system had been training for this moment for 35 years. General, ma'am, Owens began. At ease. Morrison's eyes swept the assembled soldiers with the practiced efficiency of someone reading a report. They moved across the formation. They paused, briefly, at Tyler Brooks. Then they moved on and found Sarah Chun, at the edge of the ground, her hand on the cart handle. Morrison walked toward her. The entire training ground tracked this movement. All 36 recruits, all 4 officers, watched the 5-star general of the United States Army cross the training ground toward the woman with the mop cart. Sarah Chun stood very still. Morrison stopped in front of her. She looked at Sarah's face for a moment, not assessing, not calculating, but something more particular. the look of someone greeting someone else across an enormous distance. Then General Patricia Morrison, 5 stars, founding member of Ghost Unit, senior figure in the shadow operations architecture of the United States military, raised her right hand and saluted. Sarah Chun, 1 second later, raised her right hand and returned it. The 36 recruits of Fort Bravo's new intake had various reactions to the following 2 seconds, but the consensus, assembled later from multiple accounts, was that the entire world seemed to briefly rearrange itself into a different configuration than anyone had previously understood it to be. Lieutenant Jessica Holt, standing at the edge of the formation, felt something move through her that she would describe later, somewhat incoherently, but not inaccurately, as the feeling of seeing the actual shape of something she'd only been seeing the edge of before. Tyler Brooks' face did several things in quick succession that his face had rarely been asked to do. Morrison spoke quietly to Sarah for approximately 3 minutes. Sarah spoke back. Webb, who was watching from a distance, could not hear what was said. What he could see was Sarah's face during those 3 minutes, and what he observed was something he stored carefully and took out again in years afterward. Sarah Chun, who had been perfectly still under Tyler Brooks' contempt, who had been perfectly still through 14 months of invisibility, who had been perfectly still through everything. Sarah Chun was not perfectly still now. She was listening to something, and something in what she was hearing was reaching the part of her that was usually at greatest depth, and her stillness was not the stillness of control, but the stillness of being fully present in a moment, which is a different thing entirely. He thought he understood. Morrison was saying the things that someone like Sarah Chun would not say to herself. He couldn't know exactly what those things were, but he had a reasonable sense. You didn't fail. You survived. What you carry is not a verdict on what you did. You are allowed to come back. Morrison left the training ground at 11:30. Before she left, she stopped at the edge of the formation where Sergeant Owens and the officers were standing. I'll need a full incident report on the events of Tuesday, she told Owens, and though she was addressing Owens, her volume was calibrated for the entire formation. All witnesses. Full account. Forwarded to Colonel Webb and to my office by 1600 today. A pause. All of it. Yes, ma'am. Her eyes moved across the recruits and stopped, for 3 full seconds, on Tyler Brooks. She did not say anything to him. She looked at him the way you look at something you have already assessed and classified and entered into the relevant column of the relevant spreadsheet, and the column it has been entered into is not a favorable one. Then she looked away, and Tyler Brooks discovered that being looked at by General Morrison and then having her look away was almost worse than being looked at. She left. The next 6 hours were comprehensive. Webb convened a formal hearing at 1400 with Tyler Brooks, Sergeant Owens, Lieutenant Holt, and 4 of the witnesses from Building 4. The incident report was assembled methodically, each account laid against the others. Tyler's version, by this point significantly revised from his 1600 story of Tuesday, was placed alongside 7 eyewitness accounts that all described, in varying detail, the same sequence of events. Physical contact with a civilian contractor without consent or cause. Repeated derogatory language. Use of familial rank as coercive tool. Pattern consistent with for prior logged behavioral incidents. Webb wrote the report himself, which was unusual. He usually delegated. But he wrote this one word by word, which took 90 minutes. And he wrote it with the specificity of someone who understands that documents are not just records of what happened, but arguments for what it meant. At 15:45, he sent it to Morrison's office. At 16:02, he received a one-line response, received. Actioning, which was Morrison's entire email vocabulary. Tyler Brooks received his formal notification at 1700, immediate reassignment request to Fort Jackson, pending review board determination. No promotion eligibility for 18 months. Mandatory command behavioral assessment. The last item was, in military career terms, the most significant. A command behavioral assessment was the kind of notation that followed you, that required explanation in every future posting review, that left a permanent asterisk beside your name in the places where promotions were discussed. His father's third-star consideration was, as Morrison had noted, already being withdrawn for separate reasons. Tyler would not know this for another 3 weeks. He was 22 years old, and this was, genuinely, the first time the weight of his own choices had landed on him without being lifted by someone else. Webb did not feel satisfaction about this, exactly. He felt something more like witnessing. The recognition that a necessary thing was occurring. Neither pleasant nor cruel, just true. He thought about what Sarah had said. I didn't leave the unit to hide forever. I left to stop for a while. He thought about the kind of stopping that happens before a different kind of going. Lieutenant Jessica Holt came to Building 7 at 1800. Sarah was cleaning windows again, because the windows still needed cleaning. Holt stood in the doorway for a moment. Can I? She started. Then she stopped and reorganized and tried again. I didn't say anything. On Tuesday, I was standing close enough to, and I didn't say anything. Sarah looked at her. I know. I want to. Holt was struggling with the grammar of what she was trying to do. I want to acknowledge that. Okay. You didn't need me to. I know that. But I'm acknowledging it for, she paused. For myself, I think. Because I would like to be someone who says something. And on Tuesday I wasn't, and I need to know what the gap between those two things is. Sarah set the window cleaner down and turned to fully face the lieutenant. She studied her for a moment. The gap is a decision, Sarah said. You made one decision on Tuesday. You can make a different one the next time. That's all courage actually is, not the absence of hesitation, but making a different choice than the hesitation wants you to make. She picked the cleaner back up. You came here tonight. That's also a decision. Holt was quiet for a moment. What you are, she started. What you actually are? I've been trying to process it since yesterday. I'm the building maintenance contractor, Sarah said. Not dismissively, but with something like conviction. I'm the person cleaning this window right now, Sarah said. The rest of it, she paused, and there was something in the pause that wasn't a stop but a turning, like a page, is also true. But right now, this is what I'm doing. Holt looked at her for a long moment. I think you might be the most interesting person I've ever met. That might say more about the people you've been meeting, Sarah said. And there was something at the corner of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was the structural precursor to one. Holt left. Sarah went back to the windows. 3 days later, things had settled into a new shape. Tyler Brooks was gone, reassigned, his duffel bag in a car, his bunk empty and already occupied by someone else with the efficient replacement cycle of military housing. Private Danny Reyes, his former bunkmate, had submitted his witness statement promptly and completely and had felt, in doing so, the specific relief of a person who had been complicit in something and had found a way to stop. Fort Bravo moved on, as bases do, because there was always more to do than there was time to reflect on what had just happened. But something had changed in the texture of the place. Not dramatically. Nothing had been announced, no memorial erected, no ceremony conducted. The change was more granular than that. It was in the way people moved through corridors when Sarah Chun was in them. In the way that Sergeant Owens, who had been told by Colonel Webb very precisely what Sarah's background was, at the lowest classification level that was sufficient to convey the point, nodded to her in the morning with a gravity he hadn't previously displayed. In the way that Lieutenant Holt, who had been assigned to Building 7 for a meeting with the facilities liaison, paused on her way past the cleaning cart and said simply, "Morning," and Sarah had said, "Morning," back, and the exchange was small and unadorned and mattered. On a Tuesday, because it was always a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the incident, General Patricia Morrison called. Sarah took the call in her room. The secure phone Dr. Torres had quietly arranged for her months ago for exactly this contingency. There's a position, Morrison said, without preamble. Instruction. Training the next intake. You wouldn't be in the field. You'd be in a classroom. Your choice of posting. There are 3 options. A pause. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, Sarah said. I'm offering. Sarah looked at the Marcus Aurelius on her shelf. She thought about the window in Building 4, and the mop, and Tyler Brooks' face, and Colonel Webb's face, and Lieutenant Holt standing in the doorway of Building 7 admitting something she didn't have to admit. She thought about the patch. San Bernardino is close to a base that's one of your 3 options? She asked. It's 15 minutes away, Morrison said. Then yes, Sarah said. Okay, Morrison said. Report date is the 15th. And then, in a register that was distinct from her command voice in the way that warm water is distinct from cold water, same substance, different quality. It's good to have you back, Sarah. Sarah looked at the patch on her sleeve. I never fully left, she said. On her last day at Fort Bravo, Sarah finished her shift at 1600, cleaned and stored her equipment with the same care she'd applied to every other day, and returned her uniforms to the supply room. She changed into civilian clothes, dark jeans, a gray jacket, running shoes, and walked out of the staff quarters with a single bag. Webb was in the main corridor. He was not there by coincidence, and neither of them pretended otherwise. He was in civvies again. He'd made a habit of that for conversations that mattered, and he had a cup of coffee in each hand, one of which he extended to her. She took it. They stood in the corridor and drank coffee in the quiet of a base at end of day, the fluorescent hum overhead, the distant sound of evening PT on the grounds outside. "You could have told me," he said eventually. "When I got here, you recognized me. You could have said something." "I know," she said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about this honestly. "Because I needed a version of this where I was just the person cleaning the floor," she said. "I needed that to be real, even briefly. If you'd known, it wouldn't have been real in the same way." She looked at the coffee. It was real. That mattered. He nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he understood, in the way that people nod at true things that are just slightly outside their fully assembled comprehension. "Where to?" he asked. "Instructor position. Near my sister's." "Good," he said. He said it with a simplicity that carried weight. "That's good." She finished the coffee, handed back the cup, and picked up her bag. At the door she turned briefly. "Webb," she said. "Chun." She held the look for one more second, the operational clarity still there, that quality of seeing what was actually in front of her, and then she was through the door and gone. In Building 7, the windows caught the late afternoon light. They were very clean. On the floor, a faint streak, not quite done, remained near the far corner, the one place that had always been difficult to reach, the corner the light didn't hit. Lieutenant Holt, walking through Building 7 at 16:30 on her way to the communications office, saw the streak. She found a cloth from the supply closet. She cleaned the corner. It wasn't her job. She did it anyway. Somewhere near San Bernardino, California, in a classroom with bad acoustics and fluorescent lights identical to the ones at Fort Bravo, a group of new Ghost Unit candidates received their first briefing on a Thursday morning. Their instructor walked in without introduction. She set her bag on the desk. She was 29 years old. She looked, to the candidates assembled in front of her, completely unremarkable. Average height, dark hair, gray jacket. She had eyes the color of deep water at dusk, though most of them didn't notice that until later. She looked at them for a moment, the specific look of someone who sees what is actually there, and then she said, "The first thing you're going to learn is how to disappear." A pause. "The second thing you're going to learn is that disappearing and being invisible are not the same thing." She picked up a marker. She began.